Hello and welcome to another podcast from Cardiology. Today we're fortunate enough to be speaking to Dr. Mark Mason, the Medical Director of Heart and Lung and Critical Care at Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. Good morning, Dr. Mason.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Nice to see you again. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling the audience something about yourself, your professional background to begin with.
Of course, yeah. So I am a cardiologist by trade. I am approaching my 30-year anniversary of starting at Harefield Hospital. Back in May 1993, I started, interestingly, doing a 1-month locum as a transplant registrar working for Professor Sir Magdi Yaqub, which was an interesting experience right in the early stages of my career, but an incredibly rewarding one. And obviously, the fact that I'm still involved in the same organisation 30 years later suggests that it resonated with me. So I've been very fortunate to spend a significant amount of time at Harefield in the early stages of my career. Became a consultant in 2001, specialising in both coronary angioplasty and stenting, but also in pacemakers and devices, and had a busy clinical practice for many years, but was drawn increasingly into clinical leadership, which I guess fast forwarding culminated in July 2019 in being asked to take on the role of being medical director of what was then the Royal Brompton Harefield NHS Foundation Trust. A global pandemic was not in the job description at that stage, and little did any of us know what was to come. Once things had settled down with the pandemic, our relationship as an organisation with Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust developed to the point that we agreed to merge, and we did so on the 1st of February 2021. And following that, in April 2022, and there were some technical reasons why there was a lag between the two that we probably don't need to go into, but just because of reorganisation within the organisation, I then took on the medical director role of all heart, lung and critical care services within Guy's and St Thomas's in April 2022. So I am responsible for of the order of 750 doctors or thereabouts at any given time, including obviously both consultant staff and trainees, but also importantly and one of the most interesting elements of the role is that I'm heavily involved in the conversations around not just what we are now and how we can in real time be the best that we can be, but how we continually strive to be better, both from a clinical but also an academic perspective. And I always talk about, again, a bit of a cliche to talk about a three-legged stool, but I think it's highly relevant in this sphere where, yes, of course, first and foremost, and never more important than now, that we are clinically relevant and clinically excellent. For us as an organisation, inextricably linked to that is our academic and research profile and aspirations. But then the third leg of that stool, which I think is often perhaps understandably a little bit of a poor relation, but is fundamentally important and aligned to the other two, is education, and how we go about education, not just the doctors of tomorrow, but the specialists of tomorrow, and how we make a meaningful contribution to the educational landscape.
Interesting. So if we could just go back a couple of steps, the research that's going on inside the operation, could you tell me something about that? I mean, it's quite significant. I don't think many people are aware of the amount of research going on.
And of course, I'm going to leave some yawning chasms of omissions in not calling out some of my colleagues that are doing some phenomenally important work. But if I just briefly skim through, so on the cardiac side, we have for a number of years, led in particular by some colleagues at the Brompton, had an impressive profile in cardiac magnetic resonance imaging, led by Professor Dudley Purnell. And of course, we also now have Chiara Bucchiarelli-Ducci, who is the global chief executive of the Society of Cardiac Magnetic Resonance. So we've a long and distinguished track record in imaging research, not just confined, of course, to CMR. We have an extensive, and I'm talking not just now about the Brompton or indeed about Harefield, but across all of our campuses, we have an extensive research profile in arrhythmias. On the one hand, you've got Sabine Ernst, who's been at the Brompton for a number of years and has been delivering both research, but also importantly, clinically, the only stereotaxis arrhythmia service in the UK. But then on the St Thomas's site, you've got Aldo Rinaldi, who's been a phenomenally prolific researcher, particularly in the sphere of device therapy. Then you've got cardio-oncology, which is a field that in many ways, compared to much of cardiology, is really in its infancy, but is phenomenally important in terms of the cardiac effects of both having cancer, but in particular being treated for cancer. And that is a field that is, as I say, really only in its infancy, but we've been very much at the forefront of that conversation, led on the Brompton site by Alex Lyon. We have had already to date quite a significant profile in genetics and in developing clinical genetics. Now that's again, I think a field where, for me, and I'm no expert on this, but it feels almost as if we're at the end of the beginning in terms of genetics. We're now really looking to the future, and this is where perhaps we as an organization are very mindful that there's a gap to be spanned between us being able to deliver care to one patient at a time, compared with looking towards populations far more in the future. And the advent and increasing availability of, for example, polygenic risk scoring is going to be fundamentally important. I think we would all recognize that if all we can ever do is treat a disease once somebody's acquired it, then I think the NHS is likely to really struggle. I think where we can really make a meaningful difference, though it's understandably difficult to have the bandwidth to achieve this sort of paradigm shift from focusing on treating disease to preventing disease, but it's absolutely where we need to be looking in the future. And then the other, of course, major sphere that is developing at pace in the cardiac world is in how we treat valvular heart disease. We've had for some years now the so-called TAVI, or TAVR as it's known in North America, to replace the aortic valve, but increasingly now we have therapies to deal with not just the aortic valve. The pulmonary valve has been around for a little while, but we have a number of technologies now to deal with the mitral valve, increasingly with the tricuspid valve, and providing, and will, I think, in the future provide a meaningfully viable alternative to a surgical approach to valvular heart disease, whereas I think often to date, the non-surgical approach to valvular heart disease has been in those patients perceived as simply at too high risk for a conventional, in inverted commas, surgical approach. So I think that world is changing apace. And then shifting from my, and you'll appreciate my area of familiarity in the cardiac world, but you know, I'm cited on some of the exciting developments in the respiratory world and none more so than in the cystic fibrosis community. And the advent of triple therapy for cystic fibrosis has been genuinely transformational. And in all honesty, if I am lucky enough to witness a more inspirational development in healthcare in my career, then I will consider myself to be hugely fortunate. And it's hard to imagine that I will. Just to give you a sort of a snapshot of what that means, we have, not only does triple therapy stop the disease in its tracks,
yeah,
but you'll be aware, of course, that we have had for many years, my start in the organization, a very busy heart and lung transplant program at Harefield. We literally have been able to take pretty much all of our cystic fibrosis patients off the transplant waiting list, not because their disease has stabilized, but because they've improved to the extent that they don't need transplantation anymore. Now, that's not quite universal, but it's pretty close to it. And it's phenomenally impressive. We have now the largest cohort of adult CF patients in Europe. Now, the idea that there was even the concept of an adult CF patient some years ago would have been not particularly relevant. But we have the largest cohort of adult CF patients in Europe. And I think I'm correct in saying that we did not have a single death in 2022.
Absolutely.
It's extraordinary. And as you can probably tell, I just find it so inspirational.
You were involved in the project to some extent. I think that the adoption rate, due to not just your success, but some of the early adopters in Europe, really lent themselves to the whole planet taking it on. And I wasn't aware until then that you had the largest cohort. I actually thought it was the States.
In Europe, we got the largest cohort in Europe, I believe.
Okay, no problems at all. So I also understand that there's a lot going on in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other area that I also wanted to highlight, which is again has been truly transformational, that we've been heavily involved in, is in the so-called biologics in severe asthma.
Yes.
Which again is a massive development and truly proving truly transformational for significant numbers of patients.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Mason, I think that for some of the audience listening, there'll be a lot of innovators and a lot of people who've got a young biotech, they've got a young pharma company, and they have some interesting ideas that have developed beyond the CE mark, or they've gone through the MDR process, or they've gone through the FDA process. And you guys are one of the top 10 centers in the world, the work you've done and the work you're doing. If they wanted to approach you about an innovative idea, how do they go about it?
I guess the easiest way is to look me up on LinkedIn and direct message me, as indeed your and my conversation started. So yeah. I'm on LinkedIn. My profile has my picture on it and my name and my organization. I'd be delighted to have a conversation. I think it, as I've tried to highlight, I think being involved in research and innovation is already part of our DNA, but it absolutely must be part of the fabric of what we do moving forwards. The analogy that I often cite is that if, God forbid, one is unfortunate enough to be diagnosed with cancer, yes, there's, I think for many people, there's an understanding, if not an expectation, that there's a realistic prospect of being offered the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. In our world, in the heart and lung world, I don't think that's been nearly part of our DNA to the same extent. But I think I'm really keen that for us as an organization, that is absolutely what we are about. That doesn't, and that's not to certainly not to be treating patients as in any way guinea pigs, but really to be at the forefront of the development of medical technology, and to give patients the opportunity to have access to the most innovative technologies, many of which we've just discussed.
Absolutely. I think the small cell lung cancer has been something I've witnessed a great deal of change in the last few years, and the early detection is the thing that really attracts me to it. I think that that's something that we hopefully will see in screening in years to come.
And I absolutely agree, Stephen, and worth mentioning that with that in mind, we now have a joint thoracic service with the Royal Marsden Hospital that's situated pretty much next door to where I'm currently sitting, and with absolutely that in mind, to expand that screening program, diagnose people at an early stage. Yes. Of course, one of the technologies that is increasingly going to sit behind that and will allow us to facilitate the rollout at scale that previously would have been untenable is the use of our so-called artificial intelligence. You know, I know that's sometimes a clunky phrase and means different things to different people, but you know, our clinicians here, for example, are using AI technology to automate the processing of screening X-rays, and able to achieve that in orders of magnitude more than had previously been possible.
So does that mean it doesn't need a second opinion from a radiologist?
No, I think for the foreseeable future, and I believe I'm correct in saying this, no, the answer is it does. But what it allows is a filtering at a scale that
yes,
was significantly quicker, or is significantly quicker than one human looking at one X-ray at a time.
Absolutely. Do you see the use of personalized medicine coming into cardiology more so? Do you think pharmaceutical companies could approach you about these sorts of things?
Absolutely. Bearing in mind, of course, that in my cardiac career, we've come through a world where we've sort of layered one drug or class of drugs at a time. And the obvious example is in secondary prevention following myocardial infarction. So we had aspirin, and then we had beta blockers, and then we had statins, and then we had ACE inhibitors, probably the wrong order, but you know, each class of drug, but of course, each class of drug has in many ways been studied in isolation, and not infrequently. And let's take beta blockers and ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers as an example. They're both hypotensive agents. So not infrequently, real world clinicians are faced with a dilemma of, okay, I'm meant to titrate both of these drugs, but there's only room to titrate one of them in this patient's blood pressure. Which do I do? And that I think we may well learn a lot more as we move forwards about how we, and of course clinicians have been doing it for years, based on high levels of clinical skill, of course, but moving forwards, understanding what individual patients need and how best they're managed, particularly given the number of comorbidities patients have as well, of course.
Absolutely. I've started to see the advent or the reintroduction of the idea of central aortic blood pressure come back in with pharmaceutical companies. So obviously the measurement of pressure here is different to the pressure here, and it becomes an academic argument because of the transfer functions. But I have started to see a few papers come out from some interesting pharmaceutical companies about the use of central aortic blood pressure. And I think that this might be a way of managing 2 or 3 different medications. Do you have an opinion on that?
I'm probably not well enough cited to give an educated opinion on it, but of course it sounds intuitive, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does sound intuitive, right? What about the use of the NIH?
So clearly our relationship with the National Institute of Health Research is a really important one. One of the huge advantages that we have as now part of Guy's and St Thomas's is that we're in a position to have meaningful relationships with multiple academic partners. So historically, as Brompton and Harefield, our principal academic partner was Imperial College. But of course, we now have a really important and growing relationship with King's College, also with Brunel University. So I would argue, almost uniquely placed to be able to interface with multiple academic partners, to bring multiple skill sets to the skill sets that the different academic partners bring. Clearly, one area where that has been quite prominent is across our critical care units. We saw an awful lot of that for all the unfortunate reasons, of course, during the global pandemic. But our researchers across our 3 critical care units were absolutely pivotal in developing therapies for those patients, particularly with COVID.
Absolutely, and I think it was commendable. I think the last few years have been a great opportunity to change and transform, and I do agree with you that the organisation that you currently head is a wonderful and probably very unique operation inside of Europe, if not the world, to achieve a great deal of positive outcomes. Dr. Mason, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you again. I look forward to talking to you perhaps in the next 12 months about some of the projects that are underway right now. And good luck, and thank you.
Thank you. Be delighted to catch up again.